everyone, and welcome to this HVG event in August. It's so lovely to see so many of you during the summer holidays. And to all those that aren't here, I hope you're all having lovely holidays. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Janet Lewis-Jones, who is going to be talking to us about the Investing in Volunteers accreditation. And many of us will have heard of this, but whether we know all about it and are up to date, we will find out very shortly. So huge thanks to Janet. Handing over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, and thank you for having me this afternoon. So, as Rhiannon said, my name's Janet Lewis-Jones, and I've been an assessor with the Investing in Volunteers standard since 2004. So it's over 20 years, which is terribly scary. But even before that, I was involved with the standard. I'll talk a bit about the history of it in a moment, but way back in the 1990s, I worked for a volunteer involving organisation within the criminal justice sector, and we were one of the first to go through on the sort of piloting of the standard. So I've got a really, really long history with the standard. So as Rhiannon said, I'm going to not do a lot of talking at you. Hopefully there'll be some time for interactions, breakout groups and some exploration around the standard. But we're going to start with a poll, aren't we, Rhiannon, just to get a sense of what you already know. So if I could ask you to run that would be really helpful. And then we can look at some of the results.
Yep. Give me just 2 ticks to find the poll. Here we go. Launch. So it'll appear on your screens, guys, if you just answer accordingly. Lovely. So there are 3 questions. Hopefully you've spotted. Starting to get everyone answering. And in fact, I think that might be everyone. I'm just going to then share the results. Yeah.
That's amazing. So 100% of people have heard of IIV. That's really good. And 62% actually haven't used any of the resources, but 23% have, which is great. And let's just see how many have actually been through the process. Good. So a small number. So hopefully I'm not going to be talking to people who already know a huge amount about IIV, because I wouldn't wish to bore you with that. So I thought what I'd do is just start by talking a little bit about the history of the standard and how it was developed before we kind of move into our first kind of discussion part of the afternoon. So let me just share my screen with you if I can. So hopefully you can see that around about now. That's great. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a bit of context and a bit of background. So if you haven't heard of Investing in Volunteers, or have heard of it but not sure what it is, it's often called the industry standard for any organisation that involves volunteers. And that really does apply in any sector, to any size organisation, any structure of organisation. And in the 20 odd years I've been an assessor, I personally have worked with every kind of organisation, from small community groups with no paid staff, just very kind of a state-based, right through, I think, to the biggest organisation I worked with personally was the Royal Voluntary Service, which had 46,000 volunteers at the time I was working with them, so massive setup. But also, fire and rescue services, NHS trusts. So it's not just kind of voluntary sector, it applies across the board. And what it's attempting to be basically is a definition of best practice in working with volunteers. So that's the kind of nub of what Investing in Volunteers is about. It's been developed and is managed in such a way that it covers all 4 UK nations and also the Republic of Ireland. And is it governed by a body called the UK Volunteering Forum, UKVF? And if you're not sure who they are, they're basically made up of senior leaders from the 4 main infrastructure bodies, so NCVO, WCVA, Volunteer Now and Volunteer Scotland. So senior leaders from those 4 organisations actually formed the UK Volunteering Forum. So way back in the 1990s, as I said, when I was first involved, the the standard was developed by a group of volunteer involving organisations in South London and their local volunteer centre, so it was Wandsworth Volunteer Centre. And the whole idea was to kind of develop best practice in working with volunteers, driven, I think, from two angles. One, about protecting the organisation, but also about ensuring that volunteers had a great experience. And that version of the standard ran for quite a long time, until 2020, when the whole thing was reviewed and pretty much rewritten to reflect the findings of something you've probably heard of, something called Time Well Spent, which was a huge piece of research looking at why people volunteer, what they want from the experience, what they believe a good experience looks like, but also, why people didn't volunteer, what put them off volunteering. So it really did kind of look at what volunteering was from that volunteer's perspective. And so it seemed appropriate to rewrite Investing in Volunteers to make sure that that perspective was more, I guess, reflected in the standard. And even in that rewrite, it was done in full consultation with volunteer involving organisations, so that it's still very much kind of from the sector, owned by the sector. So if you remember nothing else from this slide or from this afternoon, it's the last point that I think is important. So in essence, all Investing in Volunteers is a set of 29 statements that define best practice in working with volunteers. And it's freely available. You can go to the Investing in Volunteers website, just download it and use it to kind of inform the development or kind of refreshing of your practice, if you like. So as I say, that's what it is. In essence, it's 29 statements. It is also an award, so for those organisations who want to, they can go through an accreditation process, in which case those 29 statements become the 29 criteria against which you are assessed. Obviously, that's the bit where there's a cost implication, because someone like me needs to pop up and actually do that assessment for you. But as I say, outside of that process, the standard is there for you to use to develop your work. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oh no, I'll just show you what we're going to do next. So we're going to do some breakout groups. We're going to pop you into groups and get some of you to look at what best practice looks like from the volunteer manager or the organisation's perspective, and some of you to look at what best practice looks like from the volunteer's perspective. So we'll kind of shape your thinking around that to start with, before digging into looking at what those 29 statements look like and how you might be able to use them to develop your practice. So we've got 15 people. Just thinking, maybe if we have 4 groups, Rhiannon, would that make sense? So we'll have 4 groups. So breakout groups 1 and 2. If you look at the question of what best practice looks like from the volunteer manager or the organisation's perspective, and then groups 3 and 4, if you look at it from the volunteer's perspective, what would best practice look like from that perspective? And we're going to give you 15 minutes to chat about that, and then come back together and see what you come up with. Groupings. Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon, for remembering that. So yeah, so the 29 statements are arranged under 6 quality areas. So it's perhaps easier to kind of work with those than go through the minutiae of the 29. So I thought I'd just talk through those, get you to have a bit of a think about that, and then we can kind of unpick what that, how you might use that to refresh and renew your practice. So let's just share that again. So yeah, so the first quality area is all about vision for volunteering. So those of the 29 statements that sit under this one are all about organisations' kind of intent and the thinking that's gone into why you have volunteers at all, if you like. So it's all about volunteering being really embedded in the overall vision, the values, the culture, the aims and objectives, key performance indicators. You know, there is that thread of volunteering seen across all of those things. So there's a really clear understanding of what it is you intend to achieve by involving volunteers in the work of the organisation. So that's the kind of first half of Quality Area 1. And then the second half is all about impact. So having been clear about why it is you have volunteers involved, what do you then do to review whether or not that intention is being achieved? So how are you looking at the impact that volunteers have? What difference do they make to the organisation? If they all packed up tomorrow and left, what would be lost, if you like? So it's that last bit. It's you have this really clear understanding about why you involve volunteers. So as I say, some of the key aspects of that are around being able to see volunteering within the vision, within the strategy, really good understanding from governors, trustees, senior leaders, you know, people who don't have direct involvement with volunteers but are still part of your organisation. There is just that shared understanding of what they bring to the piece. And then also that it's evidence in kind of planning and budgeting, and you know, you can see that there is a real kind of seriousness about having volunteers around, as it were. So the ones that sit under Quality Area 1 are all about that, almost what you'd hope an organisation did many years ago when they sat down and thought they'd have volunteers, being really clear about what that was all about, what the intention is. So that's the first quality area. The second one is then having that clear intent. How do you then go about planning? So this is all about all of those things you talked about in terms of policies, procedures, risk assessments, problem solving approaches, volunteer handbooks, perhaps your volunteer management system, all of those things being in place to make sure that volunteering stands the best chance of being well managed. But then overlaying that, it's about the people that you have looking after volunteers, that there are enough of them, they have sufficient capacity to properly look after volunteering, and that they have the right kind of approach and competencies and opportunities for CPD and you know, the whole thing really. So there's an investment in the personnel that look after volunteering as well as volunteers themselves. But that said, also embedded in this quality area 2 is this concept of proportionality, and that you don't just kind of take what you do with paid staff and apply it to volunteers, that thought's been given to where that needs to be different and how that needs to be different. So it's making sure that you have proportionate approach to managing your volunteers. And I suppose the other thing that's really important in this one is the consistent application of those approaches, those procedures, those processes. And I mean, I'm not going to talk much about the accreditation process because that's not what you're here for, but in terms of the accreditation process, for the way it's arranged, almost everyone who goes through accreditation acquires accreditation because we simply don't do the assessment till you're ready. But where a small number of organisations do fall down, it is around that consistency. So it particularly applies to large organisations where you know, the people in the middle believe they have really clear policies and procedures, but then when an assessment takes place, you find little pockets of maverick activity and inconsistency. So the volunteers in those areas perhaps aren't having an equitable experience to the wider group. So yeah, so consistency is quite a big one around that. The 29 statements don't prescribe what policies and procedures you should have, just that they should be adequate for creating best practice around volunteer management. So those are the first two. Quality Area 3 then is the whole inclusion piece. So it's how do you go about making sure that volunteering in your organisation is as inclusive as possible. And we had some feedback around kind of, you know, the onboarding, the application process, having different ways of doing that, maybe thinking about different types of role you can offer. Are there you know, roles that are suitable for different types of people with different levels of availability, different skill levels, different experience levels. Yeah, so just kind of thinking around that. Interestingly, I'm doing some work this morning with an organisation that has quite a large charity retail arm, and they've just developed a new volunteer role around mending, which is something that people can do at home. So even people who choose not to leave home, or it suits them better to do their volunteering from home, can still contribute to this organisation by mending things that are delivered to them, and they can sew them for then sale in the charity shops. So it's all about that kind of broader thinking about what inclusion means. And it's looking at being very proactive about that. So not just kind of being, yes, we welcome anybody. It's about thinking about, are there any groups in society that are perhaps underrepresented in our volunteering pool? And what are we doing to reach those people? And another important aspect of this quality area is that word embedded at the end there. It's very much looking for the links being to the organisation's wider EDI strategy. So it's not kind of, EDI and volunteering is its own little thing, siloed version. It's actually, thinking about how that ties in. So particularly in the heritage sector, the more diverse your volunteers are, one might argue the more that impacts on people coming into your facilities. And it's a kind of like, it's a chicken and egg thing. So the more different people that come into your organisation, the more different people that will volunteer, but the more different people volunteer, the more different people will be attractive. So it's just thinking about how those things all sit together, and the amazing role that volunteers can play in terms of advancing that kind of inclusion and widening engagement agenda. So that's the quality area 3. Quality area 4 then is all about that onboarding process. So how do you go about recruiting your volunteers? Have you, what sort of process do you have for the onboarding, for the induction, for making sure they've got all the information that they need? And then some of the key parts of this one is that process is transparent. That it's two-way, so it does explore, what the volunteer is looking for from the experience and whether or not you can offer that to them. But it's kept as easy and simple as possible, and again, it's consistently applied. So yeah, it's about making it as easy as it can be, given there may be some constraints around things like some roles you have may need DBS checking, but hopefully there are other roles that don't, so you don't need to overly complicate things. So quality area 5 then is, once you've got your volunteers on board, how do you look after them? So really important that volunteers feel supported at all times. These two quality areas are quite interesting. If you look at the 29 statements, most of them start with volunteers feel. So these two quality areas are very much from the volunteers' perspective. So volunteers feel supported. They feel that they're part of the team or the organisation. They feel that their contribution's making a difference. They feel that there's good two-way communication, and they feel that they get feedback about the contribution that they make. And also within this one, it's about the whole kind of piece around boundaries and making sure that volunteers aren't exploited, and just kind of that whole kind of support area. And then the final one is all about valuing and developing volunteers. So this is kind of making sure that volunteers understand the value of the contribution they make. So it loops right back round to quality area 1 about why you involve volunteers. Do you then kind of share with them the impact that they have, and that contributing to them feeling valued, recognised, connected, that they have opportunities to develop, that they feel, linking back to that piece of research, that their volunteering is time well spent, that it is a really good use of their time. And it's quite an interesting one, this one. It links back to some of the feedback we had from that breakout session about volunteers being very individual. When I'm doing assessments, I find that there is such a broad difference in terms of what makes volunteers feel recognised. I remember, I'll just stop sharing there for a minute, but I remember doing a large animal charity some years ago, and every Christmas they would give all of their volunteers a goodie bag full of their corporate merchandise, and it was quite a substantial little package. And when we did the assessment, it almost felt exactly 50-50. 50% of volunteers thought that was great and it made them feel really special and really valued, and the other 50% thought it was a colossal waste of the charity's money. So it is really, really difficult to kind of get that one right, but nonetheless, it is something that you need to think about. So any questions just on the content of investing in volunteers, before I talk a little bit more about how you can actually use it to develop your practice, or kind of refresh or renew how you work with volunteers? Are there any questions? Did any questions appear in the chat, Rhiannon?
Not yet. I've got loads about the process.
Right.
but nothing about the content. It all seems very logical to me in terms of kind of, step by step, a real kind of
Yeah,
health check of your program
yeah,
almost. And I think, I've been working in the sector for 20 years and shame on me, I've never been through the process, but do you think it'd actually be incredibly helpful for me as a practitioner
mm,
as well to kind of
yeah,
really scrutinize how and why we do things. And I think
yeah,
particularly, I wrote it in the chat, particularly quality area one, because as the sort of social climate, financial climate
yeah,
changes, we need to constantly ask ourselves why we're engaging volunteers and what
yeah,
their role is, what their connectedness is to the organisation. So I think that particularly that area for me, almost, you can almost do on a far more regular basis than some of the other
yeah.
bits perhaps that are, less changeable, maybe.
Yeah. And it's also an interesting one in terms of kind of arguing your corner, because often as the person responsible for volunteering, you have to kind of negotiate your budget and help people who don't work with volunteers on a day-to-day basis, actually help them understand the difference that volunteers are making and what they're bringing to the organization. Some organizations do that as a financial kind of expression of what volunteers bring. Some do it more as a kind of social return on investment approach, but there's lots of different ways of actually presenting the impact of volunteering, which can be useful persuading decision makers, funders, senior managers. Yeah.
And on that note, interestingly, Janet, and I will then throw it back out to the floor if anyone's got any other questions. Um, does the scheme kind of support you to think about those options? Because I know I really appreciated one of the elements that you mentioned, that it's not sort of dictating that you have to do things in a
Yeah.
certain way, but that you need to have proportional and adequate um, processes, activity in
Yeah.
place that suit your context. But I guess for some organisations, including myself, actually, not being aware perhaps of
Yeah.
some of the options out there, and particularly that aspect about talking about impact
Yeah.
and the way that you can talk about impact that best suits your organization. Some organizations are skewed
Yeah.
one way than the other, and recognizing that and doing it in a way that gets the best benefit. Does IIV support you as an organization to
Yes.
explore that?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I said I wasn't going to talk about the accreditation process, but very briefly, I mean, you can, as I say, get those 29 statements, use them in whatever way you want to. But I suppose the benefit of going through the accreditation is it's described as a 12-month supportive journey. So once you register and pay, can't avoid the fact that it's a pay, once you register and pay, you then get the support of your assessor for 12 months to actually help you get assessment ready. And it's through that 12 months that those kind of conversations you're talking about there, Rhiannon, would take place. So, they would work with you. Instead of it being a kind of internal audit, it would be a kind of joint piece of self-assessment, if you like, identifying areas where you might want a bit of extra support, a bit of development, bringing in experience, as you say, from other organisations that have been through the process, and demonstrated, some good ideas around things like impact. So yeah, so I guess that's the difference. So whilst anyone can use it completely freely, the benefit of going through the process is that you get that almost like a critical friend, to work with you through the 12 months to get all your ducks in a row before you then are formally assessed. But it's by the same person, which I think is really nice and gentle and lovely and not too scary. Yeah. I'm just going to share one more slide with you and then open it up just to any questions about anything, if that's okay. So, and this is being recorded, and I can send my slides over, so don't feel you need to quickly scribble down wave links or anything. But yeah, so I've just concluded a link there for where you could go to uh, download the standard, as I say, which is free for you to use. Another freebie, if you like, there's also a kind of free starting point foundation entry level self-assessment, one of those online things where you fill in multiple choice questions and it gives you some kind of immediate response to where you sit against the standard. So that's called IIV Essentials. It's not just the 29 statements, it's kind of a condensed version thereof. Good for kind of beginning to think about it. But again, that's a freebie hosted by NCVO. And then, as I say, if you were at any point ever interested in going through that accreditation process, obviously the first thing you want to know is what it would cost your organisation, and there's again an online tool that you can fill in, and then it comes back to you with a quote about what that would cost, and those costs are worked out on, there's a kind of equation they use, I believe, and nothing to do with the money, but it's an equation that uses the number of volunteers, number of roles, number of sites, and then throws a figure at you. But yeah, so that's the end of my slides. It's yeah, open forum now. Any questions about anything I've said? You can either raise your hand or type it in the chat.
Any questions? Well, I always have questions, Janet. So I'll go in first, and we'll see if anyone creates any. Maybe a slightly challenging question. I guess what I'd like to understand as an organisation, budgets are tightening for lots of organisations, and therefore anything that has a cost to it can sometimes preclude
Yeah.
organisations from even entertaining the idea. I guess to help us, if we were thinking about going through this process to advocate for it, it'd be really interesting to understand from you what you see as being the principal benefits of taking part, and kind of if there are any, without naming names, any examples of where an organisation might have used this to kind of, I don't know, grow, build, advocate for themselves, etc.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not your sector specifically, but I'm answering it in reverse order. But some funders look for particular quality marks, or they look for quality marks without them being particular. So, some particularly corporate funders have enjoyed seeing organisations that have the IIV standard, because it's a kind of an endorsement, I suppose, of good practice. So I suppose in a very raw sense, there's that. But I think it's more about the cost benefit, if you like, is about two things, I guess. Having that kind of external pair of eyes, external expertise, almost critiquing your volunteer program. And what you get at the end is a report, obviously, that yes, it describes what you do just to confirm that you meet the standard, but more importantly, it flags up things that you do particularly well relative to the wider piece, if you like, but also in terms of the size of and scope of your operation. But also, I think more importantly, then also that the kind of raising it to the next level, so suggestions for development and improvement. And I think it's, what it costs to go through the standard would always be less than what you'd pay for some kind of external consultant to come in and do that piece with you. Yeah, so I think that's where the value lies. So if you were looking to kind of have an external consultant help you develop your program, this is probably a more cost-effective way of doing it, but you have to do some of the work yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, lovely. And actually,
Yeah,
Eldina had a very similar question, so hopefully that
yeah,
answered that for you. There are a few kind of, just thoughts in here that there are even lower cost versions of doing things. So again, I think as an organisation, it is about picking the
yeah,
right one for you.
yeah.
So it is sort of flagging that. A question from Pippa around, have you got examples of big organisations with various volunteer coordinators and programmes who've gone through it?
Yeah.
Does there need to be a central point of contact even? How does it sort of work on the ground slightly?
Yeah, so definitely there has to be a central point of contact, but they don't have to do all of the work. So what would usually be the case in a large organisation is we would suggest that they form a steering group or a working group, and it's that group that kind of carries the organisation through the process. So the process is fairly straightforward. It starts with a briefing to make sure that everybody who needs to be is completely clear what the criteria are looking for, what the statements mean. Then there's a period of doing an internal self-assessment, which we then kind of, if I was the assessor, would then kind of comment on and help you develop that into an improving practice plan. You then work on the improving practice plan, keeping in contact with me, the assessor, and then when you have completed that, you're therefore ready for assessment. We then arrange the assessment. But there needs to be a central point, otherwise, you can't communicate. The assessor can't communicate the whole group of people. But yeah. but yes, it works. I won't deny it's probably more complicated to do in larger organisations than it is to do in an organisation where there is just one volunteer manager and 25 volunteers. Yeah, that's fairly straightforward, but you know, it's doable. As I said, I've done 46,000 with Royal Voluntary Service, and it was doable.
Absolutely. And I guess, you know, we all look to see who else has done this
Yeah,
kind of programs. You obviously mentioned RVS, but
yeah.
are you able to name any of the other organisations that wouldn't mind being kind of touted as good examples that have gone
Examples.
through?
Well, there is a link on the website where
Oh,
you can see all of the current, if you just go to the IIV website, you can look at all of the current holders of the accreditation. So that's a good place. Um, Obviously, because I'm one of a team of assessors, I can only kind of name the ones that I personally have done from memory. Not that I don't know the others. Well, I mean, it is that I don't know the others because other people have done them. But yeah, people like Cancer Research UK, Guide Dogs, RNID. I'm just trying to think of any other big. I just got my list, shouldn't I? Any other big nationals that I've done recently, current holders. Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're the kind of main ones. Yeah,
some big
fantasy cats and
organisations.
dogs. Yeah,
And I think it's really lovely, actually, to one of the things I quite like about going to other forums as well as HVG events is that you
Hmm.
meet other parts of the voluntary sector, because
Yeah,
sometimes actually different parts, so heritage has a certain sort of stance on things, but the healthcare
yeah,
sector, the kind of museums and heritage sector in the other side
yeah,
do things slightly differently. So actually, learning from slightly different organisations that are set up a bit differently
yeah.
can be of huge benefit as well,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, interestingly, I was doing some work this morning that probably wouldn't apply to you, but corporate volunteering, you know, where corporates want to come and spend a day doing something useful for you. I picked up this morning that with the large organisations, there's a bit of a trend for charging for that as an income generator. So, you know, it's almost like it struck me as like one of those Virgin Experience days where, you know, the corporate is actually paying for an experience. Very different from what I would understand volunteering to be. Yeah.
We ironically we're growing our corporate volunteering program at ZSL, and it doesn't sit under me. And what we write in our volunteer policy is that
Yeah.
because they pay for the pleasure,
Yes.
so it's called volunteering. But I always do this sort of funny
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
hop around when I talk
Yeah.
about it. But it is a growing area that
Yeah.
charities can't deny. There's one last question that would be really great to answer, but as I ask that, I'm going to pop up the evaluation for the session.
Oh,
It'd be really
yes.
lovely to
Yeah.
hear your thoughts. So I'm going to ask you to multitask, everyone. Don't worry if you can't do one at a time, but I'll leave it there for those that feel able. So the last question, Janet, is around, is it rarer for museums and galleries to have accreditation? Obviously, we can be quite different to
Yeah.
some of those national and sometimes even global charities
Yeah.
like Cancer Research. And, you don't always see kite marks. Perhaps
Yeah.
we don't shout about it enough. But yeah, is there a difference? And is there less take up within our sector?
I off the top of my head couldn't answer that in any kind of empirical way, but I could say, you know, as I said, if you look on the website, there's a list of organisations that are current holders, and certainly some of those will be from the museums and galleries sector. I mean, certainly I won't name them, but I'm working with a couple myself at the moment, and just finished doing one. So there are some. But if you want a list of current ones, that's probably, you know, the best place. Oh, look, you pop it in there. Look at that. That's amazing, Ruth. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So go on that link and that will give you the answer. That's amazing.
Amazing. Well, we're 1 minute over, so I'm going to draw it to a close there. And thank you hugely,
That's
Janet,
brilliant.
for your time today. It's great to have a refresher, and it's definitely got my brain thinking about whether
Yeah.
I reconsider this again a few years after I first looked at it.
Yeah.
One thing just to say is if you are signed up to the HVG conference in October, November time, there will be a more in-depth workshop on IIV. So if you're interested and don't yet feel ready, if you're coming to the conference, delivered by some of Janet's colleagues, will be a slightly more in-depth session that will allow you to kind of go into a bit more detail as to whether it is the right thing for you. So watch that space for that one. Um, we
And
will
just
set.
can I just add to that one thing, two things. One, I'm co-facilitating that with a museum who's been through the process, and also there is going to be a discount for anyone who's at the conference who wants to go through the process. So
Oh,
yeah.
a great plug there, Janet. Thank you so much for that. That's definitely worth waiting for then. Um, just before we go quickly, we will have our usual Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Forum here at 4:15. There's a separate link for that. I'll pop it in the chat in a second. If you can join us for that. It's an informal half an hour. Otherwise, have a lovely rest of your day, your Wednesday. And again, once again, thank you so much, Janet. Really appreciate your time today.
No worries. Lovely to meet you all. Take care then.